I'm delighted to talk with you and then be on the hot seat after the paper. And I want to add to Paul my appreciation, Tom, to your wonderful paper. So thank you for making it difficult to follow you. On the ancient ceiling, the Chapel of Exodus in Al-Bagawat, Egypt, in the necropolis, we have a remarkable 6th century fresco. The section on the slide that you see, you see 7 women with torches and jars. They're walking towards a temple-like structure ready to mount the stairs. The fresco identifies the women as parthenoi, virgins. So one plausible idea is that this fresco represents the parable of the 10 virgins in Matthew 25. But of course, the number of figures is wrong. Now, another possible explanation of this chapel, here's just another scene, or a broader picture of the scene. Another possible explanation here draws on an observation by Epiphanius of Salamis in his description of a Montanist ritual. Epiphanius says, "Often in their church, 7 virgins enter with torches and white clothes in order to speak prophetically to the people." Now, the numbers add up, and if this art does reflect Montanist ritual, well, then what better place for prophecy than in a necropolis, a place of the dead? But there's an even earlier fresco found in a Christian baptistry in Dura, Europa, which is, at the time that this was used, it was on the easternmost frontiers of the Roman Empire in what's now Syria. And it depicts what Michael Papard argues is the procession of the 10 virgins. So on the eastern wall, we have 5 pairs, there you can just see, we have only 5 pairs of feet that are preserved. And then the procession moves on to the northern wall, where we see a badly damaged depiction of a door that appears to open, and then only part of 3 female figures, although it's arguable that there's room for 2 more figures. These figures are drawn larger than any other human figures in the baptistry. The women's torches are held in their right hands, and they have a bowl in their left. So Papard summarizes, quote, "In short, the procession features a group of women carrying torches and bowls, both outside and inside a door, and ultimately approaching a large white gabled structure with fiery light." Now, this quick sketch of ancient art depicting a procession of women holding torches reveals at least 3 things that I'd like to stress in this paper. First, that assessing a parable's meaning is complex. Highlighting ancient visual depictions of this parable reveal the polysemic nature of parables. Second, Jesus' parables prompt action. To borrow maybe from the speech act theory, parables do something. Parables invite response, engagement with God and his kingdom. And Dr. Long draws on this in his quotation of Catherine Sonderegger's quote, "What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. What cannot be said, however, can be shown." And this moves me to my 3rd point. It is the showing part that I'd like to explore as we look at women portrayed in the parables. To Bible readers, women are often invisible. Their voice muted or ignored, their character sullied with accusations of sexual immorality, and their actions explained away as emotional or insignificant. But the parables, as stories that invite a response, they provide an opportunity to think about how women exemplify discipleship for both men and women. And so I hope to weave the historical world of the first century with the theological and liturgical history of the church's engagement with the parables, creating a tapestry that features the women of the parables. The details of first century life assumed in the parables help us form a picture of Jesus' ministry and of Jesus himself. And the frescoes and the mosaics of the parables invite these stories into the weekly life of the church and its liturgical calendar. Said another way, the church did church with the people in the parables. The illuminated manuscripts and the carvings in the cathedrals taught the parables as part of the church's theological catechesis. So as we focus on the women in the parables, we shape our imagination to visualize women as evangelists, women faithfully watching for the Lord, women rejoicing at the growth of the kingdom. And we see the church celebrating the 10 virgins as ideal worshipers or as representing new life in the rite of baptism or new resurrected life. Other parables that we'll explore include the parable of the lost coin, of the leaven, and of the persistent widow. But I'd like to start in John with what Reuben Zimmerman calls the parable of the woman in labor, although I like my title better. Let me see, actually, go back. The parable of the joyful mother. I think that title, my title, highlights the eternal, not the temporal. Somehow, parable of the woman in labor just sounds like it goes on and on. In John 16:21, Jesus says, "A woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come, but when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that the child is born into the world." This paroimia, which is what John calls his parables, is part of Jesus' comforting words to his disciples as he faces his glory, right? His crucifixion and resurrection. And he warns them that they will grieve, but promises that later they will rejoice. In John's gospel, this paroimia has deep theological resonance. So turn with me to John 3, where we read of Jesus' exchange with Nicodemus. This picture here, this pietà, the deposition, the taking of Jesus down from the cross is it's displayed in a cathedral at Orvieto outside of Rome, and the figure there of Nicodemus with the pliers in his hand, removing the nails from Jesus so he can remove the body from the cross. When Nicodemus, this is John 3 though, when Nicodemus maintains that he knows how God works, Jesus indicates that one cannot perceive or experience, truly see, orao, God working unless one is born again. One must be born of water and the Spirit to enter the kingdom of God. So the image of birth is found here and then is reemphasized in chapter 16. Water and blood, two elements that pour out of Christ's body as he hangs on the cross. As Jesus comforts the disciples in John 16 about his impending death, he compares the woman's anticipation of her labor sorrow using the noun, yes, I have it highlighted there, using the noun lupe, and also he connects that with the disciples' pain using the cognate verb lupeo. Jesus invites his male followers to imagine themselves as women in labor, their sorrow as productive pain, if you will, pain that leads somewhere. And moreover, Jesus adds a further descriptor to the woman's experience of labor, that she forgets the anguish or her afflictions, the tribulation, thlipsis. That same word will then be used in verse 33 to describe the troubles that his disciples experience in this world. Rarely are women or female experiences held up as models for men to follow, so we want to take note here. Jesus also explains that the woman's hour has come, and that language in John is used only elsewhere to describe Jesus' death, his glorification by the Father. So Jesus is also understanding his own suffering and death as modeled by a woman in labor. So pulling these passages together in 3 and here in 16, how might the church teach on the very well-known phrase, "You must be born again"? Well, first, I think we can emphasize the importance of the incarnation. There's so much to say here theologically, but I want to underline that incarnation includes actual birth, labor, delivery, blood and water, and joy. Second, we can emphasize that men can interpret and understand their afflictions and sufferings as akin to a woman in labor. And I think this normalizes a common experience that only women have and invites men to stand in that space. And what I'm suggesting may be problematic for our moment when I realize some are accusing Christianity of being too feminine. But as A.J. Levine rightly argues, the parable should cause discomfort because they, quote, challenge us to look into hidden aspects of our own values, our own lives. And John's parousia invites reflection on true discipleship, which challenges our worldly values of sexism. Third, the sorrow of the woman in the parable, as she's thinking about the labor, I think reflects the very real possibility, in the first century at least, that she will not survive labor. So if this speaks to discipleship, it paints the picture of a disciple who anticipates sorrow as part of the deal. You know, this whole following Jesus thing, it could end badly after a rather protracted time of suffering. How are we catechizing believers towards this truth? Well, one place we might be able to turn is to an early 3rd century martyr, Felicitas. This slave woman was jailed and ready to face the arena, and the day or so before she went in to the arena, she gave birth. By herself, although there was a male guard there in the room taunting her, saying, you think it hurts now, just wait till you get into the arena. But Felicitas said this, "Now it is that I suffer what I suffer, but then there will be another in me who will suffer for me, because I am also about to suffer for him." So childbirth that Jesus invites us to think about in John 16, there's a history of thinking about that in the church from the earliest times. How about the persistent widow in Luke 18, which we've heard a lot about, and I've learned a tremendous amount. This features a well-known biblical type, a widow. A.J. Levine says it well, though, about the widow. She says, biblical widows are the most unconventional of conventional figures. Expected to be weak, they move mountains. Expected to be poor, they prove savvy managers. Expected to be exploited, they take advantage where they find it. She goes on to talk about how, and sometimes widows are destitute, absolutely, and maybe without agency. But Levine observes that's not always the case. And she says, we may be tempted to cast this woman as needing protection. But she says what can happen then is that now it's us, the caregivers, who become the role models. We steal her agency and we become her rescuers, kind of knights in shining armor to the damsel in distress. So I'm not sure that this widow is as much downtrodden as she is demanding. And I'm, okay with that. I think demanding and assertive is what we see in this passage. And I think we have a lot of evidence for widows pursuing their rights in court. Babitha is one, an early 2nd century widow. Her collection of material is found in the Cave of Letters, the Bar Kokhba cave. The failed revolt of this Messiah pretender, 132 to 135 AD. Anyway, her archives is found in these caves, and it's amazing. 2 marriage certificates, one in Greek and one in Aramaic. But she also includes other material, including applications to the judge in the court that her son's guardians increase his allowance. Babitha is a widow. Her son is technically an orphan, being cared for by guardians who are skimming off the top and not giving him money. She also challenges claims by her second husband. When he dies, his nephews want to claim her date groves. She said, no, they're not from Judah, my second husband. I own them myself. She was gifted them like an inheritance, but it's called deed of gift, by her parents. And then finally, Judah, her husband, was also married at the same time, so polygamy, to another woman, Miriam. And Babitha wants to get a loan and also her dowry back from Judah. Miriam is contesting that. And you thought your life was complicated. All that to say is that Babitha was in front of judges and had a lot of legal documents, and she's also technically a widow. So we can imagine this widow having enough free time, so enough money that she had enough free time to go badger the judge. But her language is strong, harsh, violent, not what we would call ladylike. She wants justice, and she wants her adversary to receive a penalty. She wants her own claim restored and the adversary to be in want. In other words, she wants vindication. The Apostle Paul uses this same verb that's found in this passage, ekdikeo. He uses it twice. To the Romans, he warns them not to take revenge, for God will do that. That's in Romans 12:19. We also find it in Hebrews 10, verse 30. To the Corinthians, Paul says that he is ready to punish or avenge their disobedience. This is in 2 Corinthians 10, verse 6. Earlier, he uses a cognate noun to praise the Corinthians for their eagerness to handle the situation that was addressed in an earlier letter. They showed, he says, readiness to see justice done against the one who had done them wrong. That's in 2 Corinthians 7, verse 11. All right, well, what about the threat of violence? The verb that's used, and by the way, this is the unjust judge. He's thinking to himself. It's not that Jesus is saying this or that the widow is saying this, but it's the unjust judge who uses the verb that suggests maybe she will come and attack him. That verb is only found in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 27, where Paul talks metaphorically about himself kind of like punching or getting his body into shape, and he means it spiritually as he is rigorous in his discipleship so that he can share in the blessing of the very gospel that he preaches. I know some people have thought, boy, was she even so angry that she would take a swing at the judge? I don't know. I picture her as being smart, and it wouldn't be smart to try and swing at someone who could swing back faster and harder. Ellen Aslin Reinertsen reminds us, quote, this portrayal of this hysterical, desperate, and violent woman it only comes from the judge's inner dialogue. It's not from the widow, and it's not from Jesus' narrative about her. And I think that's important to remember because we, in embellishing how this woman acts, to be careful, I think, not to sort of fall into various stereotypes and forget that she also could be quite a lot like Babitha, who I don't think ever thought she would, in her persistence, needed to hit the judge. So we should do well, I think, to ponder the woman's intensity for justice and vindication. We are encouraged to model her tenacity and her perseverance. She is for us a model. Matthew's parable of the 10 virgins in chapter 25 is puzzling from an historical context. The picture that you see here is from the 6th century Codex Purpureus, meaning purple. It's written on a purple dyed vellum, Rossinensis. That's the codex name. When I read Matthew 25, you think, okay, how much of this scene is a common wedding ceremony, and how many of the details are kind of fantastical? I had the privilege back in the late 90s to attend a Kenyan wedding that began in the bride's house, and we waited a long time in the courtyard as final negotiations on the bride price were finalized, and then all of her personal items, including her sewing machine and her bed, were loaded onto the back of a pickup truck, and we all went to the church, because from the church, then she would go to the groom's house, and she would never return to her parents' home. So I can imagine in this story that delays happen and that it's pretty natural. But there are also cultural details that confuse us, like why the oil can't be shared, and why are those who run out of oil not welcomed once they have oil? And where's the bride? Well, according to the logic of the story, readiness is everything. And we find this theme earlier in Matthew 22, verses 4 and 8, as well as in chapter 24. The Son of Man will come at a time not expected. And I think chapter 25 continues with the proclamation that the Son of Man will return with angels and give inheritance to those blessed by the Father. So Matthew is preparing us to be thinking about this unexpected timing of the Lord's return. This is this picture of the 5 virgins carrying their torches. And it's torches. I know in the English translations they'll say lamps, but actually in the Greek it's torch. It's torches. And we know in the wider Greco-Roman world it was traditional to carry the torch. It lit the way. Well, let's walk with these 10 virgins. This is from the Catacomb Comatarium Maeus, the big cemetery catacomb. So let's walk with the 10 virgins. They all have torches, and the wise one also carry a jar with oil to replenish the flame. The foolish assume the bridegroom will come soon. All 10 virgins stop along the way, waiting for the groom. They get comfortable and they snooze. This is not really a problem because they can wake up and be ready. I think of like firefighters who sleep at the station. They're ready when the alarm goes off. And the alarm does go off at midnight. Come out to meet him. I emphasize the call to come out, erkomai. The virgins needed to go to the bridegroom and escort him to the feast. They needed their torches to see the way, and the wise brought oil, but only for their one torch. They were wise. This conduct is praised. It's critical, I think, to see that the virgins move from the place where they're waiting and sleeping to the groom and then to the feast. We should not imagine that the groom arrives to see the 10 virgins lined up as though this is like a cadet review, and some have unpolished sandals or their gown is wrinkled and so slams the door in their face. No, the 5 wise virgins they're equipped for the wedding, which necessitated having a torch lit to see the path that led to the wedding feast with the bridegroom. And that's why there's no sharing of oil. This parable is not offered as a message like the feeding of the 5,000, with 2 loaves and 5 fishes. Our parable teaches about one's singular focus on the bridegroom and one's desire and delight to see him in his triumph. Well, then the final question, where is the bride? The 4th century Codex Bezae includes the phrase, and the bride, in this passage, waiting the groom and the bride. While the Codices Vaticanus and Sinaiticus do not have that additional clause. These are all early codices, copies of the Bible. Augustine and Chrysostom do not mention the phrase, and the bride, but Jerome and Origen do. Paul and Revelation can speak about the church as the bride of Christ, but Jesus nowhere says as much. But I wonder if we catch a glimpse of this idea of the bride to the bridegroom in John chapter 14, verses 1 through 3, where Jesus says that he's going away to prepare a place, a home, for his followers so that we can always be with him, just as the groom does for his bride. And the bride, of course, is all of us, men and women. In the early centuries of the church, leaders like Chrysostom taught that baptism was a spiritual marriage, drawing on Paul's words that he had espoused his congregations to one spouse, to be presented as a chaste virgin to Christ. This is in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 2. And Gregory of Nazianzus, in his work on holy baptism, which he wrote in 381, he proclaims to these candidates for baptism that, quote, "The torches that you kindle are a sacrament of the procession of light hereafter, with which our beaming and virginal souls will greet the bridegroom." So let's look again at the Dura Europa scene. Could this white building be a bridal chamber? Papard concludes that in early Eastern Christianity, baptism, quote, meant anointing, illumination, and marriage of both male and female virgin brides. Moving quickly, my comments about the parable of the leaven in Matthew 13:33 will be brief because we've talked about it a lot, including Kelly this morning speaking extensively on it. What I have to add is simply that most people in reading this assume the woman is working at home for her family. And as such, the flour amount is enormous, able to feed 50 or 100 people. But what if this woman was a professional baker? You know, women worked in shops and they sold items that they made. This is a bread. It's not what I made, although it's the preserved. It's what happened when a volcano blows up and sears the bread. So it's like stone, but it could be something that I made. Women worked in shops and sold items that they made. Here in Pompeii is a picture. It initially looks like it's a man selling, but you know what? It's actually politicians handing out bread. I know, just like some things 2,000 years are the same. Later rabbinic material cites women selling their bread, selling the clothes that they made in the marketplace. We have papyri from the early Roman period, where we have a woman who owned 25 sheep and cattle, also a goat and their young. She was registering them to pay taxes on them, and she employed a shepherd. And then we also learn of a Jewish woman named Rebecca. She's a Jewish woman who was a member of the Beer Sellers Guild. I don't know where to go from there, but I just thought that was pretty cool. Women were shepherdesses and harvesters. So I want us to imagine that while it may be the case that this woman was baking bread at home and using leaven or like sourdough at home, it's also the case that women were out and about, shopkeepers, professional bakers, and even members of the Beer Sellers Guild. But I'd like to also look at the parable from a theological standpoint and observe the large amount of flour. There are echoes of this large amount of flour in the Old Testament. Going back to Genesis 18, Sarah uses this amount of flour to make bread for the 3 guests, the 3 angels who announce that she will bear a son. And then Gideon likewise uses this amount to make a meal for his angel visitor. And Hannah, as she celebrates the dedication of her son Samuel to the service of God, she uses this same amount of flour. Now, none of this flour is leavened, but these stories all portend to great things. And I think this great event is best put by Malcolm Guite in his poem, Like Unto Leaven. The kingdom is like leaven in the grain. A woman knows the secret of this word, for she has nursed the rising life within. The 9-month hidden miracle of God, Our Lady took and hid the precious leaven, a secret ferment working in the dark. For even there within her inner haven, our Lord began in us his own good work. And earth was leavened with the grace of heaven that raises us to life, body and soul. In Bethlehem, the staff of life lay hidden, the only broken thing that makes us whole. The mystery whereby the world is fed, for Bethlehem itself means house of bread. Let's finish with a focus on the parable of the lost coin. In Luke 15, we have a series of 3 parables, which is an invitation from Luke, I think, to read Jesus' words here, these 3 parables as a unit. Jesus' response to the charge against him that he welcomes and eats with sinners. The second parable features a woman searching for one of her 10 coins. She lights a lamp, she diligently sweeps the pounded earth floor, and she discovers it rather quickly. Its value is recognized by her joy in finding it, and she invites her female neighbors to celebrate with her. The story ends in joy, the feeling that one has avoided the worst, losing something or someone, and relief and happiness, they flood and they overflow. This coin was not part of her dowry. It wasn't a coin that was stitched onto a headpiece. The dowry system didn't work that way in the ancient world. But it is interesting that she lights a lamp. That cost money. I point that out to show that searching cost her something. It was more than just, like for me, turning on the lights in my house, just flip a switch. The oil in the lamp cost real money. And I bring that up to highlight how similar this action is, her lighting the lamp, to the shepherd's action in the parable above. Both the shepherd and the woman lost something of value, sheep or a coin, and both take costly measures to find that lost item. Luke uses the same language to describe their responsibility in the loss and their joy at its recovery. There's a third parable that's well known, the parable of the prodigal son, or the prodigal father. I sometimes have heard people talk about it. I've wondered where the son's mother was, where the father's wife was. We had that question raised yesterday by one of our Doctor of Ministry students who represents the genius of all of them in that question. Willa Cather, who wrote, an American that wrote in the 1800s, she offers, I think, a brilliant answer to where was the mother. In her short story, A Burglar's Christmas. I came across this in Tim Larson's wonderful collection of Christmas stories entitled 12 Classic Christmas Stories, A Feast of Yuletide Tales, that just came out, Moody, last Christmas. In Willa Cather's story, a son leaves home as a young adult, determined to make his way, but his arrogance and foolish decisions leave him broke. So he decides to rob a house on Christmas Eve, but the homeowner catches him. It's his own mother. He has robbed his own house, even though he didn't realize it. And she embraces him. He groans. He said, "I came here to rob the house. I didn't know it was yours." But she responds, "You cannot steal what is your own." And then she hears her husband's feet upon the stairs. And so she leads her son to a chair in the room and then steps into the hallway, closing the door. And she addresses her husband with these words, "James, it's William in there. Come home. You must keep him at any cost. If he goes this time, I go with him. Oh, James, be easy on him. He has suffered so." The husband steps into the room, speaks with his son, while the woman waits outside. After a few minutes, he comes out of the room, letting her know that the son will stay in the house. Now she hugs her husband and thanks him that he gave him back to her. But James, the husband, refuses her thanks. "Don't, Helen. He is my son. I've never forgotten that I failed with him. I don't like to fail. That cuts my pride. Take him and make a man of him." He retires for the night, and she returns to her son, sitting with him as he eats a meal. Again, he feels so ashamed of his past, and he wonders how his mother could pardon all of that. But she recounts to him that he was her own flesh and blood. He's never been unknown to her. "I know your every possibility and limitation as a composer knows his instrument." And then she adds what I think Jesus might have said, "Oh, my poor boy, you have wandered so far and paid such a bitter price for knowledge, and yet not learned that love has nothing to do with pardon or forgiveness. It only loves and loves and loves." I think Cather captures here the focus of this parable, the incredible joy that what was loved is returned and been restored. And so I end where I started, with childbirth, suffering, and then great joy. Across the parables and the paromia, women's voices ring with joy, made mature and wise through sorrow, deepened through perseverance, and amplified by love. Thank you.
Thanks. We have time for Q&A. Lynn doesn't need me up here to man the Q&A, but I just wanted to say that Andrew will have a roving mic, so if you have a question, please just let us know.
Or not, because it's Friday at 3:15 and Houston has traffic.
Well, I'll give everybody a second while I make a comment. I think it'll be unsurprising to you that I really resonated with the idea that early Christians inhabited the parables through art and being present. And it's just a good reminder that the parable, and we got that a little bit the last 2 days, the parables, I think we want them to mean something. What did they mean? What did Jesus mean? But they just were created to be there and to be retold and reheard and inhabited. So I really appreciated that point. Thank you.
I'll ask. So you gave us a lot of really stirring examples, particularly.
Do you want to? Sure. People on Zoom.
You gave us a lot of great examples, really stirring ones as well, and particularly sort of a lot of hypothetical scenarios like, well, people assume this, but what if it were this? I'm curious. Because a lot of folks here are in ministry and will be preaching some of these, how have you gone about sort of trying to present that in a homiletical context in a sermon, and how much do you do or not do to then sort of be able to say what you want to say,
That's such a good question, and I am a professor in large part, well, and mainly because I've never been called to be a pastor. But I do very little preaching as a woman. So I've not, except in this, I have given sermons on the Samaritan woman. So I'm not easily able to draw on like that excellent question. I'm just problematizing things for everybody else, which is my spiritual gift. I guess what I was, and Andrew is kind of picking up on that as well, I'd like for us to imagine that when you think about the woman with the leaven, you're also thinking, and I bet her sister is part of the beer sellers guild. You know, like you don't necessarily have to say it out loud, but you can be thinking it. And that will shape, I think, how you imagine the possibilities for that. I think the passage in John, that was probably the closest that I got to, like, how would we actually think about this? You must be born again. And the reality of birth could be maybe more a part of the church, because that would involve women. And the early church did. Chrysostom, Gregory of Nazianzus, they didn't mind talking in the language that invited, just like I'm to be a soldier of Christ, so men are to be the bride of Christ. So to just make that more normative, I think would be helpful. But it's a hard thing to do, because accusing Christianity of being too feminine is a really, for many people, like that just is the worst thing you can say, the worst insult.
Hi, Dr. Cohick, over here. So part of what you've done here is bring out women in the text that aren't often seen, aside from the parable with, where she's named, but you've kind of identified other women that easily get passed over in most sermons, books, etc. Although I think there's more literature these days where we're starting to see women in the story, that kind of thing, so that's a hopeful sign. But your visuals, so this may just be like a real softball for you. That has been, I love it, obviously, you know that, but seeing you had an image for every slide that showed artwork that depicted women from ancient days to even today. Give us a little more of why that's important to help people literally see, as well as hear about the women in the story.
Yeah, I'd say two things, and thank you, Kelly. I've done 2 trips. Kelly was part of the first one, to Italy with a colleague from Dallas Theological Seminary, Sandra Glahn, where we looked at art of women, biblical women and women in the church, that we found in Italy. And over again, we saw the Annunciation, which you have here, and Visitation, where Mary and Elizabeth meet, over and over again. And it reminded me, I was struck by the fact that part of my history, my Christian history, is dampened, if not silenced. Like, it just doesn't have a real role. But the incarnation is so important in the history of the church and its doctrine, and also in our understanding of our own life today. And if we take that into Scripture, like I tried to with John 16, I think it will bring the Annunciation, that act. It's not just going to be one sermon in December or Advent, but its meaning could stretch throughout the year, because it's a theological cornerstone of our faith. And this baptistry, this surprised me the most, I think, in doing the research, how frequently you saw the catacomb art. I do think the art in Abagawat is probably the Parthenoi, the virgins in Matthew. I'm not as convinced it's a Marcionite, a reflection of a Marcionite ritual. But even if it is, what it's saying is that women are leading us in faithful discipleship. I look at these 5 wise virgins and I see myself. I should see myself. As a man, can you do that? Like, that's what I think this art, it just wasn't, it wasn't the kind of jarring back in the early church as Chrysostom and Gregory of Nazianzus and others invited men to enter into the parable of the 10 virgins, or be one of the 5 wise virgins. And seeing it, just, it reinforces it. It's like they lived. These women were there every Sunday when the church went in. They were bigger than the depictions of Jesus elsewhere on the walls and all the other stories. This was what you were to focus on. And I would love to see women as models of discipleship. So one of the projects that a group of us are working on is called the Visual Museum of Women in Christianity, and it tries to pull together these images for people to be able to see how the church has remembered women mentioned in the Bible and also through the early church.
Awesome. Hey, Dr. Cohick. I was just, as you're talking about the 5 women in this parable, I was trying to think of another place in Matthew or any of the Gospels where 5 women show up, and the only place I can think of is Jesus' genealogy. And so I'm curious if there is any connection there, or if that's too much of like a reach. But if so,
Yeah.
if that is what Matthew had in mind, how would that impact the reading of the text in your eyes?
Of how would it impact my reading of the
parable of the 10 virgins?
That's really good. I had not thought of that. That's really good. What's so interesting, the genre is so different at one level, but then on the other hand, those genealogies were to create a portrait. They were to help us imagine who Jesus is. So I love that. I think to say, well, who is Jesus? Here's who his ancestors are. Look at those. Yeah, then you're right. And then his parable of the 10 virgins and those 5 wise virgins, well, yeah, naturally, because he came from a family, there were a lot of wise women. Yeah, that's really good. See how much fun we can have in doing that and making these connections. And they are, I think, we're playing, right? We're playing, but we're playing theologically. So we're trying to say, how do we see this so that it'll live rightly in our communities, that we may be more faithful? Yes.
I'm back here.
Yes.
So thank you
Thanks.
so much for your paper. Really appreciate it. It was really interesting as a man listening. You asked a few minutes ago, can a man resonate with
Yes.
the 5 virgins? And I felt like I could. And in my own experience in churches that have followed a practice of expository preaching through whole books of the Bible, I've never found my pastor to skip those all-women sort of texts, and felt like equally men and women could sort of enter into the lessons of those passages. And it sounds like maybe in the experience of a lot of other people that maybe that's not been true, and that men sort of feel averse and say, I don't see my gender up there, and therefore I can't really resonate with that. And at the same time, you have women who would feel the same way, reading the prodigal son story. And I think that you would say that whatever gender you are, you should be able to enter into the experience and learn from it, right? Even if you don't see your gender being portrayed. So I guess my question is, how do we cross that divide? Because it just seems like there's a lot of gender suspicion these days. And I don't like to see that. I'm sure you don't either. So, how do we cross that?
Yeah, that's a good word of gender suspicion. I think that is, I think that's very descriptive. I think we just keep talking. I don't really know how else to overcome if there is a suspicion other than laying things out so that people aren't suspicious maybe anymore. Yeah, and I'm grateful and glad to hear that your experience is one where that's not been, a concern. So you're right. I'm speaking to those who have a different experience in that regard. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So my question sort of overlaps with that, but I'm struck with how often I feel like the woman is preached as the foil. So you think of the women, the 5 wise women with the oil. How often I've heard it as the 5 foolish women who weren't prepared. The focus is on the foolish rather than on the women as the wise. And so what I'm reflecting on is Jason's presentation about reading between the lines in a high context scenario. And so my question is, what posture can we come to the story where we're looking from a high context, reading between the lines to better understand the woman's place in the story rather than using her as the foil?
Yeah. Well, I think in one way or another, almost every presentation has stressed how important understanding the first century culture is. And of course, we all acknowledge that our information is so limited. And so it is hard to recreate that picture. But before the Babitha archives, we didn't have an example of a sort of average woman. We have queens that they're written about, or princesses, but just the average widow. And Babitha is one. So now we can put a little bit more shading or coloring into our picture, and I think that helps us say, well, what really is a widow at this time? So that I think having one point is having a richer historical picture of actual women, which was a lot of the attempt that I was doing and others do in this. But I think also with your point about these are foolish, that often they're drawn to look at these foolish women fall into stereotypes, which is, I think, we talked yesterday about stereotypes about Pharisees, that they serve a purpose, a totally different purpose or agenda, I'll say agenda of the pastor that slides towards anti-Semitism. So Scott and Paul trying to push against that by saying, really, what is in the text? What are we seeing? I guess that's what I'm asking here, like that the women, there are Jezebels, right? Like there's no question about that, but not all of them. And so to your point, not the stereotypes. Let's not do to women what we're also doing to Pharisees. Yeah. In the back.
Thank you, Dr. Cohick. So I just think about 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 1 and 2, where Paul says, brothers and sisters, I could not address you as spiritual, but as worldly, mere infants in Christ. I gave you milk, not solid food, for you were not yet ready for it. So at least here, Paul is using the role of mother to the church. And I'm a hospital chaplain. I attend a lot of death situations. One situation that I have most hard time is neonatal death. Because I don't have kids. So on the one hand, I feel like I can't really relate to this young mother's loss. But on the other hand, I do have a mother who loves me unconditionally. Can I imagine her losing me? And I think the Bible is encouraging its hearers to imagine. You don't have to be a mother. You don't have to be a father. But can we imagine and empathize? And I think with that imagination, I think we can see the kingdom of God in a more realistic, more authentic ways. So I don't know what my question is. I just thank you. And my frustration as a bivocational pastor, I don't get paid in the church. I love the church. I help out with the youth group and other things, occasional preaching. But I see so many women so talented, obviously called, but not recognized and not empowered. And it is very strange to me. I'm pretty new to Texas, so maybe it is what it is. But it just makes me wonder, what if we really hear from our dear sisters? Because a lot of times we just hear one side, but there's the other side. And so I just want to thank you for your work. And once again, I don't know my question is. I just want to share with you guys. Thank you.
I'm going to close. Thank you for you should have just summed up my paper and my intent so beautifully. You should have just given the paper. But that's exactly right. And I'm so blessed of your testimony with your mom's love for you that is so that represents God's love to you. And I think that Jesus invites us, as you say, to see both the Father and the Mother's love. Thank you so much. And thank you for your work in the hospital as a chaplain. Lord bless you in that. Yeah.
Just a gloss, a commentary on this moving question. my commentary would be, in light of what I've just heard, I think a wise character and compassion can really help us cross these sort of lines to see and connect in ways we would think impossible, without it. So anyway, I'm grateful as well for your response.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.